So we're honored today to have the 26th President of the United States with us, live from Medora, North Dakota, which is the gateway to the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. We've invited him to help us put last week's election into perspective. I know everybody's got an opinion, but here's a man who has seen a few elections in his life. And if you remember from your 10th grade history class, Theodore Roosevelt ascended to the presidency in 1901 at the tender age of 42 years old, after the assassination of William McKinley. He then won re-election in 1904 in a landslide, earning over 300 electoral votes and 7.6 million individual votes. It was the largest plurality in the United States to that date for a presidential election. Now compare that with Joe Biden last week, who got 75 million votes. That shows you how the country's changed. But as importantly, as good Rotarians, we all know that during this administration in 1905 was also the first Rotary Club, fondly known as Rotary One, which was founded by Paul Harris and his associates in Chicago. So in 1912, disillusioned by the direction of the Republican Party, Roosevelt ran a determined campaign again with the Bull Moose Progressive Party and delivered 27% of the popular vote, 88 electoral college votes from 6 different states. No third-party candidate has ever done better. Now, that said, his run did open the door for the Democrats to win not only the presidency, but both chambers of the House. So I guess it ebbs and flows in politics, doesn't it? But moving right along, and more importantly, the president's mom and her family were from Georgia. Martha Bullock Roosevelt was a direct descendant of Archibald Bullock of Savannah, Georgia's revolutionary president. And I believe we may hear more about that. But Mr. President, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us from North Dakota, where I believe you are finally going to build your Roosevelt Presidential Library. And since
Go ahead, Mr. Henagan, please.
Well, I was wondering, since leaving office in 1908, I guess fundraising has been a bear?
We're doing pretty well on getting our way towards a Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. And first, may I say, Chairman Henagan, thank you for having me on board, and especially to President Carr, past President Moody. Congratulations on your leadership, and Mr. Doherty on your joining an organization that puts effective action behind its motto, service above self. You are in the fellowship of the doers. And thank you as well to Brother Bowling for those kind words incorporating the 4-way test of what we think, say, and do. And now, Mr. Henagan, you've invited me to comment on the 2020 election, but I must first have a bit of a condition that you must understand. Though Mr. Henagan has dug me up from my resting place in Oyster Bay, Long Island, I did not cast a ballot in my mother's native state of Georgia in this most proximate and ongoing election. No, but I want to share with you, for the audience, Rotarians, that I do have some Southern bona fides. They were mentioned in the way of my mother being from Roswell, and my great-great-grandfather, Archibald Bullock, being the revolutionary president of Georgia. You might also know of my great-grandfather, also on my mother's side, General Daniel Stewart, from Liberty County on the coast south of Savannah. General Daniel Stewart, at the age of 14, fought for the Georgia militia in the Revolutionary War, would subsequently fight in the War of 1812 and march off to fight in the First Seminole War with 5 sons, all 6 feet tall and taller. He had one daughter, Martha Stewart. She would be my grandmother, but General Stewart did not approve of the offer of matrimony made by my young grandfather, James Stevens Bullock. Not having much patience in these issues matrimonial, my grandfather married Hester Elliott. The following year, my grandmother, Martha Stewart, married Hester Elliott's widowed father, John Elliott, who would go on to serve 1 6-year term representing the state of Georgia in the United States Senate, a time during which my grandmother was a wonderful host and a good mother to his children and their children both, returning to retirement in Georgia, where Senator Elliott died. Hester Elliott Bullock died. My grandfather successfully proposed to my grandmother, and when they married, he was marrying his stepmother-in-law. If that doesn't make me a Southerner, nothing does.
Sounds like a conversation with my mom. She knew the background and details of everybody's family in the neighborhood. So thank you for that. I will dutifully designate you as at least half Georgian.
Half Georgian, indeed.
Right. But the reason we have you here, you've had so much political experience in races in 04 and 12 and since and before that. Could you give us your point of view of what happened last week? We had a pretty extraordinary run-up and a pretty extraordinary election. And maybe you can compare them to your experience in the early 1900s.
If I may, when it comes to elections, it is indeed about the numbers and the ballots cast. It's been said the Republican Party, after the Civil War, never really had a chance in the South or even a Southern strategy until Richard Nixon in 1968. I say bull feathers. Let us look at the 1904 election. This is when I bested the nominee of the Democracy, Alton B. Parker, a judge. The only time in 4 presidential elections when William Jennings Bryan did not lead the Democratic ticket. Also on the ballot, representing the People's or the inheritor of the Populist Party, was your own Georgian Thomas E. Watson. Well, I only garnered 18% of the vote, but I bested Watson. Parker, of course, took 63%. But do you realize that in that election year, I won 11 of Georgia's counties, and by an average of nearly 49%. Of course, a strong Union part in the north, but also along the sea and elsewhere. But this is the thing that stands out to me. Do you realize that in the presidential election in Georgia in 1904, the entire state total of ballots cast was 130,986, at a time when Georgia had 2.25 million citizens. Less than 6% of the population cast a ballot in the presidential election in Georgia in 1904. Let us take a look at Tuesday and the ballots counted since then. There are a combined, including the Libertarian Jorgensen, 4,983,103 ballots cast as of a report this morning. With a population of 10.65 million estimated in the state of Georgia, that's nearly 47% of Georgia's population that is casting a ballot and making its opinion known. So I think the most important difference between politics then and politics now is there are a great many more Americans who are participating in this great experiment of a republic.
That's fascinating. So the other question I had for you, you've clearly made the transition to the social media age, and you look good online, by the way, for the age. How has campaigning changed from when you were campaigning for president versus how we campaign now?
Today, I must thank those like Mr. Jens Brewer, who makes this work over the internet. I could not have believed it in my day. We had the innovation of the telephone, which came in handy for coordinating political activities. But in my day, it was the newspaper, often published twice a day by 2 or more papers in most cities and many of the towns across the country. And when I couldn't get Congress to do the kinds of things I wanted to do, or when I felt that the political bosses were opposing my message getting out to the American people, I went over the heads of those gatekeepers. I went directly to the American people, not only through what others might write in the newspapers, but through the fact that I was a writing sort of fellow. I wrote 30 books during my lifetime, thousands of newspaper and magazine articles, but also letters to friends and colleagues that I intended to be published and shared with the public in the regions to the men to which I sent those letters. Now, campaigning also, when I was the vice presidential candidate in the election of 1900, you might remember we were still in the tradition of the office seeking the man rather than the man seeking the office. And President McKinley, the last of our presidents to have served in the Civil War, he campaigned on his front porch in Canton, Ohio, train cars full of thousands of Republicans coming to visit him, while I, as his newly appointed running mate, Vice President Hobart having died in office, I campaigned throughout the West, 16,000 miles by train. It was my role to go and press the flesh and meet with the newspaper reporters and the leading Republicans and independents throughout the country to rally the Republican vote. And we did quite well against William Jennings Bryan and former Vice President Adlai Stevenson in that election. But most importantly, I think it's important for a candidate, an office holder, to be honest and forthright with the American people. And in that way, I think the big difference between today and then was that I never took a poll. Indeed, I was quoted as saying, "I don't know what the American people think. I only know what they ought to think." And I do believe it was this level of confidence that gave the American people the fortitude to vote for me in 1904 by an overwhelming vote. Not so much in 1912, and we could investigate that issue, but I'd be glad to hear what you or members have to say about 2020. I could use some help unraveling 2020 in the state of Georgia, where, by the way, by your own constitution and laws, you remain the last state, to my knowledge, to require this system of runoff. Now, wouldn't everyone feel feel good about a square deal where, with you flipped the coin right now, I think the Democrats would have one seat and the Republicans have the other? We could get on with the nation's business, but all eyes are on Georgia.
Good luck with that legislation, by the way.
Not on a chance. I shan't merit it.
So now there are a lot of similarities between your style of presidency and our current president in terms of your reputation of being somewhat abrupt and somewhat unpredictable. And you created quite a stir back in 1901 when you invited the educator from Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington, to the White House for a meal. Now, I don't recall if it was a lunch or a dinner. You'll have to help me with that one. But what were you thinking about? In 1901, wasn't that unheard of?
Most importantly, Mr. Henagan, I must first add a point or two to your premise. There are some similarities between the President 45 and the President 26. That is, between President Trump and myself. We are both from New York. I'm a Manhattan boy, he from Queens. And, we have other points on which I think we would differ greatly. There's a directness about the president, but I hope that there was a point of being a gentleman that's so very important as well. But into the breach. McKinley was assassinated, shot on September 6th, 1901, perished on September 14th, 1901. I became at that point the youngest president in American history, 42 years and 11 months. When I took the oath of office, I said that while we were in mourning, we must not be morbid about the duties before us. It was a fortnight before Mrs. McKinley moved out of the White House and my loud and growing family moved in. It was but weeks later that I spent a day working on issues of education and improvement in the South with Booker T. Washington. And when I invited Booker T. Washington to supper that evening, where we dined with my wife and my unmarried daughter, it was indeed the first time that a man of color had had dinner with the president and his family in the White House. I was castigated the following day by Southern senators, Senator Tilghman of South Carolina, all of the major newspapers of the South, for my lack of sensitivity to Southern customs and mores. Poppycock. I've never met a man or a woman and judged him or her by his color, race, creed, or religion. And by his character and actions, Booker T. Washington had shown himself the equal of any American. I was delighted to have his friendship throughout my presidency and to speak at his memorial service in 1915 at Tuskegee.
That's interesting. So, did you ever really get along with the Southern contingent, even though you were half Southern? I mean, there was one incident that I'd like you to talk about that is traditionally, uniquely, and deeply Southern. And part of it is you're known for many life sayings. And the one in particular was don't flinch, don't foul, hit the line hard. And you were talking about football. And we have a lot of football fans in the audience with us today. And also in 2005, there were 18 to 20 deaths on the football field. Every year, apparently, there were 10 to 20 deaths every year. And so would you talk a little bit about how you saved football?
Yeah, and the fatality rate you mentioned is indeed 1905. You're right. It was during my presidency that football was a very different and violent game. the forward pass was illegal, and the yardage was 5 yards for a first down. A great violent scrum would occur. Of course, very little in the way of protection being worn by the boys. Even plays as violent as the flying wedge, in which the offense would start at a run and come rushing towards the defensive line. And at the point of collision, throw the smallest boy from the offense up and over the defensive line in hopes of achieving perhaps the entire 5 yards before landing. The boys jumped on each other with spikes and knees, dropped on heads and necks, and there's death and significant injury and cranial injuries was all about. I held a conference at the White House. College presidents, football coaches, famously Walter Camp, he, the famous player coach of Yale University. I said, men, the game is on trial, and unless you come up with rules for the safety of the players, the game may be outlawed. You may know in Georgia itself, a boy had been killed on the college gridiron. The legislature considered legislation to outlaw the game at college, and the boys' parents came to the state capitol to testify against the law, stating that their sons so loved the game, they wished the game to be preserved. I told those coaches and presidents at the White House that I did like football, that life was like football, no flinching, no fouling, and hit the line hard, that I would indeed rather have the game with the violence than lose the game altogether. But I chastised them to take up the rules to make it a more safe game. Chastised, they went away, held more meetings, and in the following year, 1906, came up with new rules. 10 yards for a first down. The forward pass now legal. It spread the game out. It's what you watch on Saturday and Sunday, and that was the beginning of the National Collegiate Athletic Association all those years ago. But if I may, first, in honor of Mr. Doherty from the small town in Massachusetts, and a football story too, much in the history of your beloved Atlanta. You're not the first man to come from the small towns of New England and make it a prosperous occasion here in Atlanta. I speak of my friend, General Leonard Wood. He, the commanding officer of our regiment in Cuba, a White House surgeon, educated at Harvard. Captain Wood, when he served in 1893, stationed at Fort McPherson in Atlanta, at which point, having already played for the Crimson, the 11, the football team at Harvard, he was walking by each and every day Georgia Technological School, saw the boys playing football, offered to play on the team. They brought him to the college president's office. The college president said, Captain Wood, you can play on the team despite your advanced age of 33 years, but you must enroll in at least one course. Captain Wood enrolled in a Woods course, organized the football team, and organized the train trip to Athens, in which in 1893, Captain Wood, at the age of 33, playing against Georgia, well, you know how it went. Georgia Tech won the game 28-6. And Captain Wood came back with a cut eye, a beer bottle having been thrown at the players by the Georgia fans in Athens. So there's great history for football, even in Atlanta. And congratulations on it being, remember, it's just a game. It's just a game. There's so much more important in life.
Well, it's the personal attacks and the conflict and the violence is all part of baked into the American psyche, I guess. So some of the reading I've done back in the Jefferson and the Adams and the Hamilton period of time, there was a lot of divisive personal attacks against each candidate and each person's point of view, and we had a lot of that going on in this current election. So was it that way when you were being elected as well?
And since Mr. Henagan, I do live in a glass house, I should know not to throw stones myself, but it wasn't much different in my day. In 1912, running against my own hand-chosen successor, William Howard Taft, I first ran for the Republican nomination, won 8 of the 12 primaries held that spring. The bosses stole the election at the convention in Chicago. I became that bull moose progressive. A time during which I called my old friend, William Howard Taft, a pudding head and a puzzle wit. Of course, he thought me a danger to the Republic for my seminal idea, since given away, of having popular referendum on judicial decisions. The progressive movement gave us the direct primary, which indeed would be codified in the United States Constitution in 1913 by the 17th Amendment, requiring the popular election of our United States senators. And also during this time, It was a time of referendum and initiative at the state level, many progressive influences on state legislatures, bringing the people closer to the levers of the operation of the government and perhaps nudging aside the political bosses along the way. But campaigning was rough and tumble, and very often there were, of course, fake news is the word today. There were reports in the newspapers that were so untrue and incorrigible that I coined the phrase the muck-raking press. From Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, where the men with the muck rakes raked up the muck and mire of human existence rather than seeing that celestial salvation was offered to them. So I had a difficult relation with the press myself, perhaps one of those areas in commonality with the incumbent. But I was the first president to offer permanent office space to members of the press at the White House, establishing the White House Press Corps office, something I'm sure many of my successors deeply regret.
I can guarantee you they do. So let's take that a bit further. So in policy and points of view of the Republican Party, President Taft's Republican Party that you broke away from in 1912, how does that compare to the Republican Party today? We all evolve. It seems every election, each party evolves a little differently. So how is that evolution taking place in your mind?
Part of the split that came about in 1912 is because that when I did return from hunting in Africa for the Smithsonian and touring Europe to accept my Nobel Peace Prize, etc., when I toured the country, I saw that Taft had returned our Republican Party back over to the special interests on Wall Street, the men that I called malefactors of great wealth, the land robbers, and those who skin the forests. So I said my hat was in the ring. I undertook my campaign in part because I was a Lincoln Republican, and that was the party of the shopkeeper and the mechanic and the farmer. When I advocated the square deal, that everyone before the law should be treated equally, that indeed the economic interests of the poor and the uneducated and those living in the rural communities were just as important and equally important as the interests of wealth and capital along the coasts. Well, it was this sort of thing over which we fought as Republicans. I can't say exactly how the splits will go in either of the two major parties, but I think despite my success as a third-party candidate, you achieve success by winning an election, winning 6 states amongst 48, and 27% of the popular vote in an election where Wilson, a man who also has connections to Georgia, Savannah specifically, perhaps one of your speakers in times to come, he can give you some analysis as well. But I say that one of the things that we've got to do is make sure that both of the parties tend towards more the middle rather than the extreme. I even said of some of my fellow progressives that every forward-thinking movement has within its ranks the lunatic fringe. The vast majority of Americans are indeed in the middle. It could be the center-left or the center-right, but it's the middle. And I hope that when these elections are over and the business of getting down to doing the business of government is back upon us, that we'll find the vast middle to be a greatly populated place.
Interesting. So you had a lot to do, if you remember my history, you had a lot to do with acquiring the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal was one of the big medals or the milestones in your presidency. So, and I also heard from a good source that you were recently able to talk about the Panama Canal situation and decision with our own Jimmy Carter. Jimmy, who is revered here back in Georgia and is now 96 years old. I guess he's the second oldest president that's still out there. And so you acquired it. He sold it back. How'd that conversation come out with you and Jimmy? Excuse me, you and Mr. President Carter. My apologies.
I have such great admiration for President Carter that when I had the opportunity to come back again and speak on President's Day in recent years in Plains, Georgia, where the old Plains High School is now the Jimmy Carter Historical Site, administered by the wonderful National Park Service, which was itself established by Wilson, about the only thing that fellow got right. Well, at this particular meeting in the auditorium of the old high school, President and Mrs. Carter were in attendance. I could not help myself. We had so much in common. I congratulated President Carter on the wonderful legacy he had in the United States Navy. He and I both partial to the submarine. I congratulated President Carter on his work with the Camp David peace accords, bringing peace between Egypt and Israel, much as I was able to bring peace between Russia and Japan with my Portsmouth Treaty in New Hampshire in 1905. I congratulated him on the wonderful Anwar National Wildlife Refuge and his conservation legacy, of course, pointing out that it was during my administration in 1906 that the Monuments and Antiquities Act, which gave the executive that authority, was passed, and I used it the first 18 times, including the Great Grand Canyon. Well, by this time, I think the audience, including the President and First Lady, were aware that I was probably making this more about me than about President Carter. I thought I would offer him the floor, but with this rejoinder. I said, now, this is all just wonderful, but President Carter, you and I have got to talk about the Panama Canal, and it was not a very Rotarian thing to do, but here I was wagging my finger at the former President of the United States, breaking all rules of gentlemanliness and collegiality in that case, but when the former president laughed, it gave the audience a chance to laugh, but I was in earnest. The Panama Canal was and still should be American. And, well, perhaps a subject for another, perhaps more contentious day than this.
So we have a question from the audience that follows up on your muckraking answers.
Sure.
So one of the things every president has an issue with is getting painted in a poor light, and only and the press painting him in a light with only about half the information. So how did you encourage a more a better press, a more consistent press, and a more honest press? And that's a bias. It's how did you create a press that actually gave the real story?
And if I may, Mr. Henagan, a very good question, and I did so by building strong relationships, real friendships with the men who then were the writers in the newspapers. If you go back to my time as police commissioner in New York City, it was Jacob Reese, the wonderful newspaperman and photographer, who with his flashbulb showed us inside the tenement houses, the famous book, How the Other Half Lives. In Cuba, Stephen Crane, Ed Marshall, amongst others, Frederick Remington. 20 years prior, we had collaborated when he illustrated my hunting trips of a Western ranchman, so that I invited these newspapermen to go on hunting trips along with me, or to scramble through Rock Creek Park on my famous point-to-point parks. Now, it was understood that what I said was in confidence, unless in the offices of the White House, I gave permission for a certain statement to be used. There was a tremendous degree of trust and respect between me and many of the newspapermen. Of course, there were others like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer that would put anything, including lies, on their front pages. I would sue Pulitzer for libel later in my life. And William Jennings Bryan, why, he ran for the presidency himself in 1904 and was rejected by the Democratic Party to run against me. But I don't think his newspaper was worth the 2 cents it cost to purchase.
Some days we have that with our paper here, but if Kevin Riley's listening, not every day and not every article. Well, thank you, Mr. President. This is a fascinating conversation. So, anything else about the current election that we've just had? You know, we have 2 senator runoffs that are in the next 60 days here in Georgia, which may change the balance of the House, or excuse me, change the balance of the Senate. Any thoughts on what a Senate that's the same party as the president does for you?
Oh, it's exactly what I benefited from throughout my presidency. The numbers here at hand. There were 90 senators in the United States Senate during my term, until increased to 92 by the addition of Oklahoma to the Union. And during that time, I had majorities averaging a majority of 23 seats during that time, often having something on the order of 59 or 60 Republican seats and but 28 or 32 Democratic seats. In the United States House through my entire term, Republican majorities, with majorities ranging from the thinnest of 28 to, after that 1904 election, 113 seats for the majority, 249 to 136. Imagine how complicated your elections would be today if, as in my time, every election there were more members of the United States House allocated. When I began, the United States House had 357 members. When I concluded, it had 391. It was the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929 that finally capped the numbers of that more boisterous chamber to 435. I had a great deal of trouble with the Senate. I later, when I ran for the presidency in 1912, said that there were so many investigations of corruption in the Senate, the senators at that point still being elected by the state legislatures, and they controlled very often by the political bosses. I said that there were so many investigations of corruption that when they called the roll in the senators did not know whether to respond present or not guilty.
That's good.
President Carr.
I'll tell you, I've just enjoyed listening to you reflect on our modern times, as well as weaving it in with your original times over 100 years ago. And you did make me think of two questions. And Bill, can I just jump in? Or
Please.
All right. Well, so I have two questions for Mr. President, and then I had one question for the person who's impersonating that president so well. So you were known as a trust buster. And I want to explore that just for a moment. And you were known as a conservationist. And I want to explore that as just a moment. On the trust buster side, you, if I remember my history, you were a capitalist. You were a staunch capitalist, but you did fight monopolies. And, I think the Food and Drug Administration came out of your work about food safety. And I know you put a lot of constraints on railroad rates, the Hepburn Act, on interstate commerce. So how would you view today's powerful tech companies, and what would be your thinking about how to consider those?
During my presidency, we established the United States Department of Commerce, eventually Commerce and Labor, in which was the Bureau of Corporations, which investigated and required and requested the opening of the books of publicly traded companies. This would eventually become the Securities and Exchange Commission. Well, I didn't wait to see the books opened. I sued against the Northern Securities Trust. This was a combination of Northern Railroads, Mr. Harriman, Mr. Hill, and J.P. Morgan. The following day after the announcement by Attorney General Philander Knox, Morgan came to the White House. He said, "Why didn't you just send your man to see my man and patch these things up?" I said, "That's exactly what I did not intend to do." We wound up having a very cooperative relationship. This is perhaps a more regulatory approach to keeping corporations from running afoul of the Sherman antitrust laws, which prohibit acts in restraint of trade that are deleterious or harmful to competitors or to consumers. And eventually, our trust busting would continue on to the Standard Oil Company of the Rockefeller family. I do believe economic analysis looks back and said when we busted up the Standard Oil Company, the family members wound up with a majority of ownership in all of the subsidiary companies that were subsequently established. We probably quadrupled the wealth of the Rockefeller family, unintended consequences of public policy. On conservation, very glad that I was able to establish 150 million acres of national forests, 5 national parks, 51 bird sanctuaries, now known as national wildlife refuges, and game preserves as well. And take on the moniker Conservation President, knowing that conservation means the wise use and utilization of natural resources, that it is the right and duty of this generation and every generation to use the natural resources, especially of the public lands, but to do so in a way that leaves them in a better condition for future generations and not in worse. Boy, you've got me back up on my bully pulpit.
Well, you started answering my second question, which, and by the way, I can tell you like a fight, right? So a question came in from the floor, even as you were speaking, what has been the impact of the national park system? And more broadly, as you think that answering that question, how are we today? And I know you're one of opinions. How are we today as stewards of natural resources? So those two questions.
Delightful. Mr. Carr, thank you. The national parks, when I laid the cornerstone at Yellowstone, begun by President Grant and Congress in 1872, at Gardner, Montana, that arch now known as Roosevelt Arch, above are the words from the Organic Act creating that park in 1872 and repeated again in 1916 at the creation of the Park Service for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Our parks are the most democratic of our institutions, for they belong to every American. And to that degree, I'm so delighted that a vision of my cousin Franklin, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, is nearby to you, and you're not all that far away from Ocala National Forest in Florida, declared by me to be the first national forest. And if I may, perhaps coming near conclusion, and perhaps not having a fully addressed, but knowing as well you're coming near conclusion, let me say that it was asked what Rotarians ought to be doing in these days ahead. You must certainly be in the arena, right? You must do good deeds, knowing that the price and penalty for them in this country, no good deed goes unpunished, unsecond-guessed, Monday morning quarterback, criticized. Persist in your good deeds as Rotarians and as citizens, and when criticized, perhaps take heart from some words I shared with the French at the Sorbonne in 1910. I said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man and today to the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error or compromise, but who knows the great devotions, the great enthusiasms, who spends himself in a worthy cause, and who, in the end, at the best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, that his name shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." Oh.
Well, Mr. President, that I can understand how you, when you did your railroad tours of campaigning, that you stirred up the crowds and got them going. So wonderful end there. And as our last question, this one goes to Joe Wiegand, who, by the way, everyone, is the one who has portrayed President Roosevelt, and he's done so throughout the nation. You've even done it in the White House, I know, for President Bush during his administration. He had a front row seat for you right there. Talk about pressure. But what is just as you reflect back on just your tour of duty as the former president, how is Teddy Roosevelt perceived today by people?
Thank you, President Carr, and what a delight to be with you and your fellow Rotarians in Atlanta. And how the country's changed, all for the better, I think, mostly, and how Rotary has changed. It would have been a meeting of all white men a century ago. I'm so delighted for 30 years to be a Rotarian. The idea of service above self put to action. They did call Theodore Roosevelt's presidency a fellowship of the doers for all of the men and women involved. Of course, we celebrate now the centennial this year of women's suffrage, and in a century have gone to a place now where a vice president of the United States is a woman, and a woman of color. Theodore Roosevelt, I think, would look down and be very proud of all that we've accomplished as a people. And also, if he came back to life, I think less entertaining than my comments would be some of the preaching from the bully pulpit he would do about the duties that we have for good citizenship, about how we really have to live the golden rule and care for our neighbors as well as we do for ourselves, and take care of ourselves and shift for ourselves. One of the great things one learns by hunting is how to shift for oneself and be responsible as well. He's a complicated character, mostly remembered for the conservation legacy, but he should be remembered for peace through strength, the building of a modern American Navy, indeed the Panama Canal. He said that was his greatest legacy. The Great White Fleet sailed around the world during his administration, and he toured the country caring about the common citizen. His Presidential Commission on Rural Life is where we have the origin of the agricultural extension offices and services out to the rural poor. The best days of the Republic are yet ahead. And as a fellow Rotarian, 30 years in Rotary myself, all over the country, including my alma mater, Sewanee, Tennessee. And yay, Sewanee's right. Delighted to be with you today and look forward to accepting some of that wonderful past President Moody hospitality at one of your meetings in Atlanta. I hope to come and visit Mama's house, Bullock Hall in Roswell.
Well, and I think we will all make a pilgrimage there to your mother's house in Roswell. So thank you. Well, Joe, thank you very much. You brought to life someone for me who was always a hero, but you've brought him to life in voice, in energy, and that's a rare event. And I think, Bill Henagan, thank you for inviting Joe to our screen. I do think you excel in a personal live setting, but you were able to translate it to the virtual world very well. So thank you very much.
And thanks to Mr. Brewer and to all in the club, bully for Rotary. Bully.